As we continue on in topic number 2, let's come to next steps number 5 through 7, which together are observation, interpretation, and application, or OIA. First of all, let's look at the in-depth version of OIA. If you remember from earlier lectures, I mentioned that there's 2 types of ways to do OIA. There's in-depth and there's survey-style OIA. And so let's talk a little bit about those 2 different methods to do observation, interpretation, and application. Application and interpretation are going to be somewhat similar, but observation is a little bit different, and so we need to talk about the distinctions between these 2 methods and how you do them. First of all, let's look at a definition of in-depth. Now, in-depth, we find that in-depth breaks down the text by verses, sentences, phrases, and sometimes down to individual words. We call this observation. In-depth then explains each of those observations piece by piece so that we can understand the fullness of what's being taught to us through the scriptures. We call this interpretation. And then thirdly, in-depth seeks to draw out the Lord's desired change in our lives from what we've learned in this passage. We call this application, or OIA. And so that's what in-depth does, especially with regards to interpretation. It's down at the verse level, the sentence level, and sometimes even down to phrases. Sometimes you'll have verses that are rather large with a lot of thoughts inside of them. And so if you don't look at them in smaller pieces, you'll miss a lot of the detail that are inside of those verses. But of course, that depends on where you're at and maybe even the type of literature that you're looking at. Maybe if you're looking at the Psalms, you'll have 2 ideas repeated and you can observe one of them. There's a lot of parallelisms that are in the Psalms, and so it changes a little bit. We'll look at the specifics as we go along with regards to the different types of literary literature inside the Bible, poetry, prophecy, various things like that. But that's generally how it works for in-depth. Again, we call this OIA, or observation, interpretation, and application. Now, continuing on, let's look at the significant use cases for the in-depth method of OIA. First of all New Testament books can be done using in-depth OIA, and I would actually recommend that you would do in-depth books with in-depth OIA. It's possible to do survey style, but it's not as effective in the New Testament because you need to look at the smaller pieces, and you'll see that in a moment when I tell you what survey style is. But so in-depth looks at the tiny pieces, and that's oftentimes very necessary in New Testament books. Now, secondly, it can also be used for select Old Testament teaching passages. Now, the reason why I say this is because there's some places in the Old Testament where it's not as effective to use in-depth. For example, if you're going to be looking at the first 7 chapters of First Chronicles, that's a lot of genealogies. Are you really going to get a lot of content, of good content from a genealogy? Well, actually, you might be abusing the text because a genealogical list wasn't meant for theological purposes. And so if you're looking at the little tiny pieces there, you're probably going to get some kind of a weird understanding because it's meant to have a record of the names of the people. That's why it was given. So you can really just do that as several big pieces. I mean, there's some important things to understand in there. For example, like the fact that it spends a lot of extra time on the tribe of Judah versus the other tribes, but that's something you can look at in the bigger pieces and not down to the individual phrases as you go through those passages. Another example of that would be the first 6 and 7 or 7 chapters of Leviticus, which all talk about the Old Testament sacrificial systems, and there's quite a few different sacrifice types. You've got the burnt offering, and you've got the grain offering, you've got the sin offering, you've got all the peace offering, you've got the trespass offering, and so there's a lot of different types of offerings, and each of them has a specific way that you're supposed to sacrifice the animals and different animals you're supposed to use. Now, There is significance in the sacrificial system because, of course, that points to the Lord Jesus Christ. But a lot of the activities that they had to do back then, that those chapters detail, you don't really need to know in the same depth that they did because they actually had to perform it. Nowadays, we don't need to sacrifice a lamb or a goat or a bull, and so we don't need to know how to slice the bull's neck. We don't need to know how to drain the blood out. All those various things, we don't need to know those things. The bigger picture is that this relates with the Lord Jesus Christ, and it might be even significant to think about how each one of the sacrifices relates to the Lord Jesus Christ, but not down to the individual minutia of the small details. It might be better to do a portion like that is survey style because you just don't need to spend all that tiny time on those small pieces. Number 3 is select Old Testament poetic and prophetic books. There are certain poetic books that it may be beneficial to do in depth, and maybe some that it might not be beneficial to do in depth. For example, Proverbs is beneficial to do in depth because there's a lot of tiny little nuggets of wisdom there in the Proverbs that you need to be able to look at individually. But for example, the book of Job, when you're looking at the tiny details of, for example, his friend's bad advice to him in the middle chapters of the book of Job, you got to be careful of that. You don't want to go too in depth on that, or at least you want to recognize that what his friends said might be suspect. We don't know exactly all of which parts are suspect, but the Lord later rebukes Job's friends and says that they said wrongly. And so when we're looking at the middle portion of Job, we got to remember, hey, the Lord rebuked them for what they said here. And so we have to really weed out what is true and what is not based on the rest of the Bible. But it's an accurate record of what his friends said, and then it's an accurate record of the Lord rebuking his friends for saying those things. And so we need to be careful with that. Maybe it's better to do it survey style to understand their main arguments, and then later on how the Lord rebuked them in those main arguments. And so those are some examples of that, of use cases. Mostly New Testament, definitely very profitable to do it in depth for all of the New Testament. And so in summary of this, in-depth inductive study can be used in any area of the Bible, but some areas are maybe less appropriate to use in-depth versus later on survey style. So let's look at the strengths and weaknesses of in-depth. First of all, with the strengths. In-depth can bring out the fine details of the text. And this is something that you can't get in survey style because it looks at the bigger pieces by its very nature. And so when you need to look at all the fine details of the text in a book like Hebrews or Romans, you got to use in-depth because it looks at all the tiny details. Now, in-depth can also build a systematic and full understanding of a book or passage because you're going through it piece by piece and building up your knowledge and your understanding and hopefully application of the book as you go through all the tiny details and keeping it in perspective with the greater focus of the book. Now, looking at the weaknesses, a couple weaknesses here. In-depth has the potential to lose perspective of the bigger picture if it's not paired with a good outline. So as you're going through the individual verses and going down to the phrases, and sometimes the individual words as necessary when there's a word that really needs explaining, then there's a potential for you to lose perspective of the bigger picture, the bigger plot, what Paul is saying in the bigger pieces of the passage if you're just looking at the tiny, tiny details and not thinking about the overall thoughts that Paul is trying to bring across. Like, why is he saying these things? In context with what he's been saying before, what's his whole point in this portion of the passage? And so in-depth can lose perspective. It has a potential, at least, to lose perspective of the bigger picture. So that's why it's good to have an outline and good to know where you're at in the outline so you know how the individual parts apply to the whole. Number 2, in-depth has the potential to go too deep. And this is kind of carrying on with the same idea. But I've seen times where pastors will spend an entire sermon on two words, and maybe they'll have a cross reference, and then they get to the cross reference and they explain the cross reference, and then there's a cross reference of a cross reference, and then they're explaining that one, and you have no idea where they are at. They're so deep and so far out from the passage that you have no idea where they're at with regards to where they started from. And so don't go too deep when you're looking at in-depth. So the warning there is don't lose perspective and don't go too deep. Now, let me give you an example of in-depth using Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3. That verse says, "Who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high." Now, this is Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3, and it's an example of a relatively large verse with a lot of content in it. And as we're looking at this verse, it's quite difficult to understand the whole thing when looking at the entire verse all at once, because there's a lot of different content here. There's a lot of questions that could be asked of the individual pieces. But when you're looking at it as a whole, maybe the only observational or interpretational questions you could ask are, what does this mean? And that's a terrible question. You should never just ask straight, what does it mean? Ask about the details of the text. But of course, if you can't see them, then it's hard to ask questions about them. Now, what you do is the process of observation. And so in observation, by the way, I'm skipping the first several steps. I'm skipping reading. I just did read, but I'm skipping outlining for this portion since we're just looking at one verse. And then I skipped the other steps 3 and 4, and we're just focusing on observation, interpretation, and application right now. And so looking at this, I'm going to break this down into smaller pieces, and that's observation. So there. Now you see how that's done, and now you could break this down into 4 or actually 5 pieces. That first observation there, you could actually break that down into 2 pieces itself, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person. Now these may say something similar, and so, but there is some distinction there, so you could actually split it in half, but I didn't have enough space on the page to fit it all, so I just put them together. But so the first part of that, who being the brightness of his glory, now you can ask a specific question about the text. You can say, how is Jesus, because that's the who is referencing Jesus in the previous verse, how is Jesus the brightness of the Father's glory? Because that's the his. His glory is referring to the Father. So how is Jesus the brightness of the glory of the Father? What does that even mean, that he's the brightness of the glory of the Father? Like, does that mean he's shiny, like he is a glow of like light coming out from his body? Well, of course we know from the gospel accounts that's not the case, except for one time on the Mount of Transfiguration, but otherwise Jesus wasn't walking around with light shining out of his fingertips or something like that. And so how is Jesus the brightness of his glory? In fact, what really is the glory of God? And that would be a great place in interpretation to go back and look at the book of Exodus, where the Lord proclaims his glory to Moses by declaring his name, his character, his characteristics, who he is. And that's really what Jesus is as well. Since Jesus is God in human form, he shows forth the character of God to its maximum, to its fullest. He is the brightness of the Father's glory. So when you see Jesus, you see the character of who God is, the loving, the justice, the righteousness, the mercy, all those aspects. That is who God is. In fact, Jesus is the brightness of that, of who the Father is in that regard. Now, also, then you have the second one, which it's kind of talking about something similar. It's a similar concept, the express image of his person. And so that's the exactness of who God is, who the God Father is, Jesus is. It's talking really about his deity. As Jesus said, I and my Father are one. It's talking about he is exactly who the Father is in the sense of deity. Now, of course, there's 3 persons. We believe there's 3 persons in the Trinity. There's Father, Son, Holy Spirit. But at the same time, the exactness of deity that the Father is, so also the Son, Jesus Christ, is the exactness of deity. And so you can get some great interpretation by asking questions about these particular parts of the verse. But if you don't break them down into these small pieces, you're never going to get that good interpretation, because you're not going to know how to figuratively chew on the verse. It's too much. There's too much to chew on, and you just end up choking on it because you can't swallow it all at once. You don't know how, or you end up spitting it up, not understanding it at all. So you got to break it down into pieces and figuratively chew on it a little bit and understand it a little bit before you can get some good interpretation out of it. So once you've broken it down, then you'll add in and so that's observation. And once you've broken it down in observation, then you'll add in your interpretation. Now, interpretation, I would say, equals explanation plus significance. So when you're explaining the text, you're just talking about what it means, in maybe bringing in terminology that you or I can understand more easily. So you're explaining the terminology and then also sharing the significance. Like, why is this significant, or why is this important? And you do that for each one of the observations. And in that in that interpretation, you're explaining what is in only the observation right above it. You're not explaining the observations down below or the observations up several spaces. You're explaining the observation that's right before that interpretation. So, for example, the second observation is, and upholding all things by the word of his power. You're just explaining that. In the interpretation right below it, you're just explaining that observation. That's it. Nothing else. And if there's nothing to explain in that, then maybe it's part of a larger piece. Of course, don't skip anything. We'll talk about that as we get to the guidelines for OIA in just a little bit. Don't skip anything, but know how to put things together in pieces that actually have some significance and have something to explain. Now, after that, you would add in your application. An application should be consistent with the author's intent. It should also be specific and practical. And in your case, in your personal notes, it should also be personal. So specific, practical, personal, and according to the author's intent. Now let's look at a survey or at survey style OIA. So first of all, with the definition of survey style OIA, survey style breaks down the text by segments, which are generally one event or one story in a narrative book, or one idea in a non-narrative style book. And so this is very much dependent on your outline. If your outline is good and accurate, then also your survey style will be accurate as well. So make sure you have a good outline, especially for survey style. It should be the same as in-depth, but in in-depth, it's not quite as significant because you're looking at all the pieces, whereas survey style, you're looking at a summary of all the content. And if your outline's bad, well, your survey style is going to be really bad. Now, after you've done that, survey then seeks to find a key verse or key verses that contain the main concept in the passage, and we call this survey observation. Or it's observation, but I call it survey observation because it's built around one key verse or key verses. Now, as we'll talk about, usually the way that that's done is that you would actually find the key who, the key what, the key where, the key when in the passage, and that that's possible to find that in one or two key verses, although not always. Next, survey explains the concept of the whole passage through the key verse, giving both a content summary and explanation of the significance of the passage. We call this survey interpretation. So notice there's two parts to the interpretation: the content summary, or what's going on in the passage, and then an explanation of the significance of the passage. Now, this might not be so necessary, the content summary, if it's a very, very small passage, but generally survey style, you're not looking at a small passage. You might be looking at, maybe 10 to 20 verses, and you're trying to explain what's the main thing that's going on in that passage. And so content summary and then also significance. And then lastly, survey then seeks to draw out the Lord's desired change in our life from what was learned in the passage. We call this survey application. Of course, just like in-depth, it has observation, interpretation, and application, though it's done just a little bit differently. Now looking at the significant use cases for survey, it could be used on all Bible narrative passages, both primary and supplemental, especially in the Old Testament. When you're looking at, for example, the book of Ruth, you could easily do it survey style and get the main idea of the book, which is what the Lord's heart is through the main idea of the book. You can still get that. Now, I wouldn't. For most Old Testament, it can be used as the primary method. You don't need to do it again in depth. You can just do it in survey style. If you're doing, for example, the Gospels in the New Testament, I would suggest either half survey, half in-depth for the significant parts, or you could do it, either maybe all in-depth or maybe add in a little survey style in various aspects, but probably supplemental more for the in-depth for the New Testament Gospels and maybe even the book of Acts. But when it comes to the Old Testament, usually it's no problem to use survey style. Now, number 2 is New Testament teaching passages. This should only be used as a supplemental. And I know sometimes people who will do let's say they're teaching or preaching, and they'll decide to go through the entire book, let's say the book of Philippians, in 1 week initially, and then go back and do the book of Philippians again in depth through the whole book. And so, of course, doing the survey style through a book like the book of Philippians would be relatively quick, maybe 1 or 2 sermons, and then you could go back and do the entire book in depth, and that would take several months, probably maybe even up to 4 or 5 months, depending on how quickly you go through the book. And so it's best to use survey, if you use it at all in the New Testament, to use it as a supplemental way of doing OIA, not as the primary way of doing OIA. Additionally, number 3, Old Testament teaching passages. This could be used as a primary or supplemental method of OIA. And then Old Testament poetic and prophetic passages, also primary and supplemental, depending on the particular book that you're looking at. Next, with the strengths and the weaknesses. First of all, survey style can help us gain a wider perspective so that we can see the big picture of a book. Sometimes if you're going too slowly through the book, you'll experience what we say in the States as missing the forest for the trees. You can't see the forest for the trees, and you're stuck looking at the trees, but you can't get that wider perspective of what's going on until maybe you would climb one of the trees, get up to a height where you can actually see where you are inside the forest. And that's what survey style does. It allows you to back up and see the bigger pieces and not just the small tiny pieces that you would see in in-depth. Number 2, survey style's inductive study can help us give a quick introduction to the main concepts of a book where time is limited. For example, let's say you're starting a new church, and let's say you started off in a New Testament book, but you want to give some Old Testament background, but maybe you don't want to spend 3 years in the book of Deuteronomy going in depth. So maybe you could do a survey style through the book of Deuteronomy and take like 4 months or so and give them a good overview of the book of Deuteronomy, and then get back to the New Testament, especially since it's a new Christian population. They need to spend a lot of time in the New Testament before the Old Testament can become really meaningful. And so that's something you got to figure out. You got to still give them some Old Testament so that they can get that perspective, that understanding, but how much is too much? And so survey style might help you in that spot, give a quick introduction to various Old Testament books, and then go back to focusing on the New Testament. With regards to weaknesses for survey style gains a very broad understanding of the text. So if you're looking at something in the New Testament, like Romans or Hebrews, I could never recommend doing survey style on those books because there's just too much content in there that's absolutely significant for our understanding as Christians. You just need to go into the details. You need to really go in depth on those books. Secondly, survey style has a difficult observation process, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment here. But it has a difficult observation process, more difficult than the in-depth observation process, and so that's one of its weaknesses. Or, well, it's just a difficulty. It's a reality, a real difficulty for this process. Now, if you were to get the observation wrong, then number 3 would apply, which number 3 is survey study can have an easily incorrect interpretation result. If you observe the wrong things in the passage, then your summary is also going to be wrong. And so that's something to watch out for as well, that because it's tied to the observation. Observation is wrong, the interpretation will most certainly be wrong. And so that's something to think about. And so carefully observe the correct details when you're doing survey style. Let's go ahead and look at an example, a survey example from Isaiah 44, verses 13 through 17. Let me go ahead and read this passage very quickly for you. It says in verse 13, "The craftsman stretches out his rule. He marks one out with the chalk. He fashions it with a plane. He marks it out with the compass and makes it like the figure of a man, according to the beauty of a man, that it may remain in the house. He cuts down cedars for himself and takes the cypress and the oak. He secures it for himself among the trees of the forest. He plants a pine, and the rain nourishes it. And then it shall be for a man to burn, for he will take some of it and warm himself. Yes, he kindles it and bakes bread. Indeed, he makes a god and worships it. He makes it a carved image and falls down to it. He burns half of it in the fire. With this half he eats meat. He roasts and is satisfied. He even warms himself and says, 'Ah, I am warm. I have seen the fire.'" Verse 17, "And the rest of it he makes into a god, his carved image. He falls down before it and worships it, prays to it, and says, 'Deliver me, for you are my God.'" Now, if you want to, you could even pause this lecture right here and try and figure out what you think would be the main key verse or verses or parts of verse. Think about the questions who, what, where, when, and ask yourself, are there any who's? Are there any what's? Are there any where's? Are there any when's? And what are the main ones? Who's the main person? What is he doing? What is the main actions in this passage? And then if there are any other significant details, think about that. So you could go ahead and pause it and then come back in a few minutes when you think you've found those observations. Okay, so you're back and you've spent some time looking at this passage and the observations that you're going to do. Now, there's 2 ways to do this. You can either just grab the verses that you think are the key verses, or you can leave all of it there and give some kind of a distinguishing mark to the parts that you think are the observation, the key observations. And so that's what I'm going to do, so you can see all of it, and it's kind of helpful that way. I'm going to make bold and underline for the observations. So that's the observation. I would say verse 13, where it says, "The craftsman stretches out his rule and he marks one out with the chalk." Verse 14, "He cuts down cedars for himself." Verse 16, "He burns half of it in the fire. With this half he eats meat." And then verse 17, "And the rest of it he makes into a god, his carved image. He falls down before it and worships it, prays to it, and says, 'Deliver me, for you are my God.'" Now, if you're going to go to then observation, what I'm going to say is that I'm going to give first a summary of this passage, and I'm going to say something like, in this passage, we find ourselves with the example of a craftsman, somebody who makes something. He's a skilled worker of metal or wood, various different things. And so we see him, he starts off to make a design, and we know it's going to be a design for an idol based on how this passage goes. And then he goes into the forest and he cuts down a tree for himself, a cedar, very nice tree. Then, oddly enough, before he even makes his god out of this tree, he takes half of the tree and uses it as firewood, and then burns that firewood in order to roast his lunch or his dinner, whatever it may be. And then he takes the other half after he's done and is eaten, his fill, and he makes it into a god, and then he bows down and worships before it and prays to it and says, "Deliver me, for you are my God." Now, obviously, the Lord is using this as a way to show how silly idol worship is. Can you imagine? You cut down a tree, you burn half of it, and you worship the other half. I sometimes wonder with these people who made idols, what if he's praying to his wooden idol and his prayers are not getting answered? I wonder, maybe he thinks to himself, oh man, I burned the wrong half. Maybe the other half was the God and this half is just a piece of wood. It's so silly. It really is so silly, idol worship. But isn't that just how people are, even to this day? Even if they're not worshiping a piece of wood, we all have idols in our life. Even in this day and age, maybe it's something that takes up all your time, all your passion, all your money, and you just pour whatever it is to it. Well, so oftentimes you step back and realize how silly it is, the things that you're spending all that time, money, resources, whatever it is on it. Sometimes we take a step back and we say, wow, how silly is that we have so much passion for this one particular thing, and that's a reality that sometimes is true even in our lives today, even if it wouldn't be worshiping a physical idol. And so that's the significance. So a summary and significance of the passage, both for their time and even also for our time today as well. So that would be the interpretation portion, and then you would go through the application portion. And maybe with the application, if you're looking specifically to yourself, you might ask yourself first, what things in my life have become an idol, a silly idol that I need to get rid of? Maybe you could even pray and say, Lord, please help me recognize those things that are just, stupid idols in my life that I need to remove from my life. And that may be even your application as you seek to follow the Lord more.